Mr. Hayworth, are you going to check for quorum?
We have four.
You have a quorum, okay. All right. What I'm going to propose to do is move straight to number 5, the report from the Ombudsman, and then to 6, the report from the Student Advocate, and then we can go to, afterwards, to leadership report, executive director report, committee reports. Okay. Have all of our energy.
Oh, thank you. Great, but
You ready? I guess I didn't warn you, so.
that's all right. Do you have Okay. Thank you. All right, so I'll just go ahead and jump right in. I'm really glad to be here to present the work that we've been doing all year long. I'm excited, so let's get started. So, let's go ahead and turn to the next slide. So our overall table of contents. I'm going to quickly go through the yearly data because we've been doing all the quarterly meetings. I don't think that any of this data is going to be a surprise to you. Where I would like to emphasize is the recommendations and take our time going through those and trying to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. Does that sound good? Yeah. Okay. So highlights from the yearly data. You've heard me say at almost every meeting that our numbers keep increasing. So for the year, we've had a 34% increase in the number of cases. So that's not a reflection of the number of contacts. We've had more of an increase in contacts, but 34% in the number of cases handled. Our top categories are bullying and student safety, special education and disability, and communication and engagement. And while special education is not our top category, or the top category, it's important to know that 50% of all of the students that we've worked with actually receive special education services or have a 504 plan. So cases by category, again, here's the graphic, you see the breakdown, percentage-wise. The only other notable thing I can say here is around academic progress. It's actually lower than I anticipated, but I do want to stress that this may be a slight surprise, the difference in special education versus bullying and safety, because in our previous meetings I talked about special education being the number 1, but what we did, we had that the category called school environment. Do you guys remember that kind of vaguely? In that category, we were losing really valuable data. It was getting dumped in there, and we couldn't see the trends. So our fellows and our assistant ombudsman went back through all of the data from the year and recategorized all the cases that were under school environment, and we got rid of it as a category. And that's why we're now able to see bullying and student safety as our top category. So some other distinctions, like highlights to point out, is our cases across, or the case categories across grade bands. You'll see special education and disability is running at 29% in terms of our elementary school cases, but it's down to 17% when we look at our high school cases. The other, one of the other key distinctions is bullying is 30% in elementary school and 18% in high school. Now, well, I'm going to get to that. All right, so in this slide, we're comparing the percent of cases that we've had that were special education / disability cases, as well as the percent of cases involving a request for evaluation or evaluation is in progress. And then that yellow line is the percent of cases that are academic progress cases. What we're seeing is essentially an inverse relationship between the cases that we've received around special education and academic progress. So as the students are matriculated, well, for our callers who have called who have been in elementary school, same set of facts as academic progress tend to report issues pertaining to special education rather than academic progress. But when we talk to the parents about, again, very similar fact pattern, we're not talking about it in the context of special education, we're talking about it in the context of academic progress. And I think that when you look at the orange line that talks about the request for evaluation, you see is that deep dive from elementary school to middle school, and then that kind of continues on to high school.
Could that be because in
elementary schools where they're evaluated?
So I think the trend is saying essentially that students are more likely to be evaluated in elementary school versus middle school or high school.
So that by the time they get to middle school, they're not being evaluated, they've already been evaluated.
Right, and I don't, well, I would not make that assumption.
Isn't that a statistical thing you could find out?
Perhaps, but this report is focused on our data. So we haven't done a deep dive analysis of comparing this to like all of the data that exists.
I mean, when if I'm a vet, if I've got a problem,
Sure.
okay, do you find out if I'm special ed or
Yeah,
okay, or I haven't been a vet?
so if you call about an issue, we do track to see if you are receiving special education services. Yes, that is a question that we ask. That's how we get the data. When we get to the end, like maybe let's talk about this some more, okay? So the other thing I wanted to show is in elementary school and middle school, the numbers for bullying and student safety that like the calls for that are percentage-wise are about the same, but then there's a drop in high school. I don't think that I want to say this differently. So what's happening in elementary school in particular is that we're getting cases that are far off from actually being bullied, right? Like there are a lot more parents like my child was hit at school, they were being bullied, right? So, but in high school, when we get a call about bullying, it's much more likely to be like very severe and actually potentially meet the criteria for bullying.
So question about that. Is there an objective criteria? I'm sorry, Bryce. Is there an objective criteria? And is it set by the state? Is it something the Ombudsman's office uses?
So if you go into, it can be found on the Office of Human Rights.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And for the elementary and middle categories, I guess we should assume that more than likely you take less of those cases on, or more of those referred out.
Best practice is to, and again, like this is all, we work to try to follow the same guidelines that the Office of Human Rights recommends, and their recommendation is to validate parents' concerns and handle the situation like using the same process, right? So that they recommend that to schools and like all the time. We don't want to be dismissive of parents. So cases by sector. There is literally like nothing all that interesting about these two slides. When you compare DCPS to public charter school cases, you're getting about the same thing. The reason why I wanted to put it in there is because when we get to talking about recommendations, whether you all as a state board or our recommendations or even like OSA's recommendations, understanding that we have to, when we look at recommendations, that they can't just apply to one sector because the students are facing the same issues regardless of the sector that they are enrolled in. This chart really highlights the top 3 categories across all of your different wards. And again, that special education, disability, bullying, student safety, communication, engagement are really rotating across the various wards in terms of 1, 2, or 3, but they're all still going to be your primary topics. And if you all are looking for more specific data for your ward, I'm happy to schedule a meeting with you all to talk about the breakdown. Sure.
I'm sorry, real quick, and I know I'm backtracking. One thing, bullying and student safety issues, especially at the high school level, anecdotally, how many of those are conflicts in the school, and how many of those have you found as safe passage?
I mean, so part of the challenge with that is sometimes the issues that are happening inside the classroom spill out and become safe passage issues. We have had calls that I distinctly remember, like even like recently, like within the last few weeks, of situations where there was not even a student at the school who was showing up during dismissal, and there were issues. But I would say that most typically it is an issue that is sort of, there is something that happened inside the school or outside of school with, you know, and then they're organizing or threatening fights after school.
What does communication and engagement?
I'm really happy that you asked that question.
It sounds very innocuous.
Yeah.
But it also sounds like it could be a preceding behavior towards bullying and student safety, in that I'm not communicating very well, so I'm going to engage you.
So I'm really glad that you asked that question. And there is a distinction. So if there is typically an altercation or an issue, even if it's like verbal, like between students, that has the possibility of presenting a safety issue, we classify that under bullying/student safety. However, if there's an issue, when we talk about communication and engagement, we're really talking about parents, right? And the parents and teachers. So like communication between parents and teachers and what that is actually looking at. So some of those cases involve barring notices that parents have received where they're not allowed to be on the school campus, right? A lot of the communication and engagement cases are like barring notices, but also potentially a staff member at a school saying something very derogatory or negative to potentially the student, right? Name calling to the student, cursing at the student, and not getting back to the parent, or saying something negative or derogatory to the parent, and vice versa. Or it could also be failure to provide communication about a significant incident that happened at the school, right? So maybe the child may have been injured, but there was no incident report, or the parent picked up the child and found out from the child that there was an incident, not from the school itself.
Could I just make a suggestion?
Sure.
That maybe it would be negative communication and engagement, rather than, because what you just described right now to me doesn't sound like communication and engagement. Sounds like communication and engagement. It's a positive thing. And I think, and we're looking for things that aren't. I mean, you don't get calls, unfortunately. People don't call you to tell you all the good things that are happening.
I've never gotten a call about a positive thing that has happened.
But I think
Maybe you have. I have not.
I don't know anything about drugs and blood tests and stuff, but this sounds like a false positive to me.
So, sure, that's a perspective to, but at the same time, one of the things that's important to remember about the Office of the Ombudsman is that we are neutral. So that all of our terminology, we work to make sure that our terminology is as neutral as it can be, which is why we're not.
But like bullying and student safety is probably as neutral as you can get, but it's still, the stuff is still negative. I just think that, you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
To me, you did a great job of explaining what it was.
I totally understand. I totally understand. And can we put a pin in it and get back to it at that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So now for recommendations. We made 3 recommendations, and I don't know if you all had a time to go through the annual report before today, but I hope that if you don't have a chance to read the whole thing, that you look at the recommendations themselves. But the 3 recommendations that we make are, 1, that schools publish a list of special education services that they're going to provide, that they provide, or that they have provided over the last 3 years in-house. Okay. The second one is to set guidelines for manifestation determination review meetings, and the last one is to create a citywide RTI framework. I'm going to hit the first 2 rather quickly and try to spend more time on the third. Okay. So for special education service offerings on site, so on the school campus. So here's some background. Schools are required to provide free and appropriate education to children. You all know this. Even those students that have disabilities. In order to do this, sometimes LEAs use private schools, what we call non-public placements, and they send kids there because they don't have the capacity to meet that child's needs on their actual campus. When you look at larger LEAs like DCPS, they may have certain placement schools that have the services, so even though that student is within the DCPS LEA, they're assigning a particular location to that student. Here's the problem. We get a lot of complaints from families who want to be informed during the lottery process of what schools are offering on their campus. So not having that information creates a barrier for them in terms of deciding where they're going to send this or which schools they're going to put on their lottery application. But here's the problem for schools. Schools do not want to even create the slightest impression that they wouldn't serve the child's IEP and that they're violating the law, right? Like, that's not what we want our schools to do. The other challenge that schools have with providing that information is, excuse me, is that they can't necessarily guarantee that that student, even if they have the program, that they can enroll that they're going to have the capacity or the space to enroll that student. So there's no guarantee is the point. I guess the last point I'll add on that is even if the school has the program or has the staffing to meet that need 1 year, that doesn't guarantee they're going to have it the next year. So,
can I ask one question about this in terms of how you all are thinking about the recommendation with respect between LEA versus campus? So I'll give us the example that in Ward 6, Tyler Elementary has a language immersion program. I, as a family, may apply to that program, but based on my child's disability, the LEA may choose to place them somewhere else where they do have the services to meet the child's needs and provide the free and appropriate education, least restrictive setting.
right.
If I'm a KIPP, I may not have the ability to do that on my one campus, but the Learning Center may do that.
Right.
Versus if I'm at Center City, maybe none of my campuses have the ability to do that within the entire LEA in terms of we've never served a child with nonverbal, who is nonverbal and also on the autism spectrum, for instance. So when you think about the recommendation, is this list of who we've served in our LEA, or is it campus by campus?
I mean, I think honestly it has to be campus by campus because that's what parents are looking for, right? Like at the end of the day, I mean, even like, you know, all the examples that you provided, but even within these, like parents typically want like a specific school.
Sure.
So that's really the information that they are looking for.
Great, that's super helpful. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Do you want to do discussion recommendation by recommendation, or which are recommended?
I'm scared that we're not going to have time to get through everything, but I would, and I prefer. Oh, I'm sorry, that's my mom. But I think it would be better to hold questions to them. Okay, so here's what this recommendation we feel like it solves. It does solve some part of the issue of giving parents more information than what they have right now, right? That's one. But what it doesn't solve is we understand that the listing of all the special education services offered in-house over the past 3 years doesn't necessarily guarantee the staffing, the space, or the enrollment. So that issue is still going to be present, but it just gives parents one more piece of information. I mean, one case that I am thinking about from last year is where Barrow literally toured schools with a parent to help find the right placement. This is a huge issue. Okay, so now I'm going to shift to discussing the manifestation determination review. So by way of background, how many people are already familiar with MDR? Okay, so kind of. Okay, so I will do the background. All right, so when a child has special needs, has an IEP, and they get to a long-term suspension, and I think now 6 days or more is where the trigger counts. They have to have a hearing. It's called a manifestation determination review hearing to determine whether their behavior that they were potentially going to be suspended for is actually a manifestation of their disability. If it is a manifestation of the disability, then you can't suspend the student. So, okay. So part of the challenge with this is that under the MDR, the federal guidelines do not dictate what actually has to happen at an MDR hearing. Sort of worst case scenario is when we've seen a piece of paper that says there's no description of what the disability actually is for the student, there's no analysis of why the school concluded that the disability was not a manifestation. It's like literally like a one-page, one-sentence, the disability is not a manifestation, or the behavior is not a manifestation of disability, and then suspension happened. So what we're recommending is that we should actually set some guidelines around what that hearing should, or what that review should actually look like. And at a minimum, providing notice to parents, at least 24 hours notice. In some cases, parents are called hours before to say that we're having this hearing at the end of the day or whatever. But at least provide 24 to 48 or 72 hours notice to parents so that they can have an opportunity to be present, but also to actually have guidelines that make sense, quite frankly, and that are fair to students, including like identification of what the disability is, a description of the behavior that the student is potentially going to be suspended for, and a list of the symptoms, like as identified in the DSM, that really allow the school to do an analysis of why they believe one way or the other the student should be suspended because it's not a manifestation.
Does DCPS have any kind of guideline?
So DCPS,
I'm talking about the biggest LEA.
yeah, I understand. No, DCPS does have Chapter 25, which does talk about their process for suspension hearing and administrative hearings and things like that. But no, I mean, as far as we know, there are no guidelines, actual guidelines that structure what an MDR is supposed to look like.
Have they been called on that?
Not by our office.
But I'm talking about anybody.
Exactly. Well, sorry, it's not illegal. That is right now there are no guidelines. So because there are no guidelines, it doesn't violate. There's no. Exactly.
So can we just do that?
All right. So now we're going to get into response to intervention. Here we highlight the problem around response to intervention as there really is no system-wide or city-wide system for providing academic supports to students outside of special education services. The type and methods of supports change from school to school and don't necessarily transfer with the students. And really the big question under like why we need a system like response to intervention is to really answer the question, like how do we implement stronger systems that help to identify students suspected of having a disability? That is ultimately the question. So our recommendation is as a city, develop an RTI framework. That framework would have to have two components. The first is that it would have to establish and set these catalysts, timetables, and responsibilities of schools. And the second part would be to build a database system that allows for RTI, response to intervention tracking and record keeping across schools and LEAs. So I'll ask this later. How many people are already familiar with response to intervention? Okay, so we got the teachers, basically. Okay, so.
What? Yeah, we should explain it.
Okay, I'm gonna explain it. Okay.
We have a viewing audience.
Yes, we do. So what is response to intervention? So response to intervention starts with high quality teacher instruction in the classroom. But it's a multi-tiered teaching approach that does allow for differentiated instruction within the same classroom. It does help to identify students who are not fully grasping the material that was taught in class. And they do this through ongoing assessments. And then you provide the student or students who are not grasping that material with interventions and supports. So we talked about, or I mentioned the multi-tier as I was defining RTI. Generally, there are 3 tiers. The tier 1 starts at high quality instruction in the classroom and is applied to the entire class. The second tier deals with interventions, students who didn't master tier 1, right? And they need some level of intervention. But the intervention that they need is not so drastic. So they just need interventions and support with grade level objectives. in the third tier, these are students who, when they were assessed after tier 1, didn't meet the second cutoff, so were placed in the third. But because they were placed in the third, in this case, they often need assistance with foundational materials. So this is like, I feel like I'm gonna get in the weeds, but so this would be, the first two, for example, would be core standards, core curriculum standards for grade 5, and the fourth one would be grade 4 core curriculum standards. Does that make sense? I see confused faces. It's okay. Okay. But the point of the RTI structure is, if you're performing here at tier 3, you're going to need additional interventions and supports. It may likely be more frequent and more diverse in terms of the interventions that are needed. But in tier 2, you'll need some supports, but not as many as tier 3. In tier 1, you're fine. You're on track.
Just factual question. The 2
Sure.
times a week and the 5 times a week, those are just, you just throw them in as examples.
Yep, that's right. Okay. There's no way that you can see this, I think, even well on this screen or in the slide deck, but it is printed well in the annual report, which should be in your, it's on page 20. Okay, so this is how a response to intervention works, and it is a yearly cycle. You'll start at the tab that says beginning of the school year. So you'll start by looking at the data from the previous school year for that student, and you'll administer what's called these universal screeners to determine which students need tier 2 and tier 3 supports. Then you'll develop and implement the plan of intervention for those students. One of the things I want to explicitly make clear, this is you're reaching groups of students, not individual. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's very different from like the special education pullouts and that sort of thing. After you've developed and implemented the plan for interventions for the student, you see that little pencil out image? That means that you're going to utilize quality tier 1 instruction, of course, as always, but then you're going to continue to do those tier 1 and tier 2 supports for at least an 8-week period. You're going to collect work samples, at least 2 work samples per week, and you're going to track the work sample on progress monitoring chart for each student. So you'll be able to see the growth or potential regression. Then you'll do a first review checkpoint. During that time, that's where you're gonna do your assessment. You're gonna review your progress monitoring chart to determine where the child is and whether or not they met that goal. And if the student met the goal, then they would be shifted back up to tier 1. If they didn't, they go to tier 3. Does that make sense? At some point, and I think that this chart doesn't identify when that happens. That's something that the city will have to determine. But at some point, like when a child would be ready to necessarily be referred for special education evaluation, that has to be determined. But this cycle happens throughout the whole year.
Again, just factual, is this what you guys put together? This comes from an LEA, or this comes from a reg, or from a formal?
So this is a summary of how RTI works. Okay.
Just as a side note, my last year at Cardozo 2 years ago, we did this for the whole year with the seniors.
Mm-hmm.
And it really, it was extraordinarily successful because of the buy-in from everyone.
Yeah.
So that was the same year that the blue thing happened, or the year after that. 2016. So I'm talking about the year 2016-17, and we had, I think, maybe 6 seniors didn't graduate, but nobody that didn't deserve not to. That's it. I think I said that right. Double negative. All right. But it really worked. But in order for it to work, there has to be buy-in from everybody.
Everybody. No,
We had meetings after meetings with parents and students, and started winnowing numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So at the end of the beginning of the third advisory, the numbers were down, and we were meeting with the same kids we've been meeting from first and second cycle.
No, thanks for sharing that. Actually, Ketchum, the school that had the most growth in the park scores, they have a very robust RTI program. So this leads into our next slide. Like, what's the impact? What happens when you use RTI, and like how does it really work in terms of improving scores for the whole school? So in our year one, you see that the lowest 25% of student performers are scoring between the 650 and 700 mark. But when you use a system like RTI, then by the time you get to year two, that their lowest score is now closer to 700. But that also pushes the overall student score higher. So it's constantly pushing everybody higher because you're even though you're always going to have a lowest 25%, but their lower score is going to be moving higher. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So what do we need in order to make this work? So one of the foundational things that we need are research-based interventions. The goal for all public schools is to have access to the same interventions. That's the whole point of creating a citywide structure. We believe that the list of interventions should be very expansive, but also finite enough for teachers to be expert in those interventions. The other thing that we need is a citywide data system. Right now, we've got DCPS using a system, we've got our LEAs, our charters using different systems, a single member LEAs using whatever system that they're going to use. But these systems don't always speak to each other and often don't speak to each other. So then what happens is that as a student is transitioning potentially from DCPS to a public charter or vice versa, that data is lost. Schools have also articulated that even in cases where they're able to identify the students who need intervention and additional support, that the way that the school day is structured, they don't have time to give that support. So part of it, as you say, when it comes to RTI, you do need that buy-in, but a part of that buy-in is making sure that school leadership is creating schedules and adjusting schedules in a way that will allow for those interventions to actually be provided. Of course, teachers also need training, and we need dedicated personnel who understand RTI and more than one person, so that when that one person leaves the school, there are other people who can continue the program. And also, as Fraser has said, that family partnership piece is important, and not waiting until after a framework has already been developed and then sharing it with parents, but actually involving them throughout the process is essential. Okay. Question.
So,
I've got a question about the resource needs, your last slide before that. When you were talking about the citywide data system, it sounds to me like nobody knows what the other people are doing, and some of the other people don't want to do what the other people are doing, so that's the big problem. How can we have to have help from above in order to get that done? We can advocate for it, but we really need to have somebody saying, you know, why do I leave one school or go to the other school, and my school information isn't transferred along with me?
No, you're right in the sense when you're saying we need help from above. There is no way that any one agency, office, could do this. This is literally like taking everyone who works in education and involving them in the conversation and getting opinions, having an analysis or a report done on what it would cost to have a program like this, not just a database system, but also what it would cost to hire and train staff, how much it's going to cost to pay for the research-based interventions. I do think that one of the important things to mention and to just know is that there are a lot of schools who are already doing RTI and are doing it very well. Part of the challenge, though, is not all schools are doing it, and that even the schools that may be doing it well, if those students leave that school, those interventions and supports aren't necessarily documented and shared with the school that they go to. That's a big part of the problem.
One of the things that I've seen as a problem over my tenure is a lack of coordination between what's working between schools and how we're sharing those best practices with each other. I mean, we've got all of these charters that are meant to be innovation labs and they're innovating, but then that's not coming back to our largest LEA, DCPS, and sometimes some of the charters have good relationships. I really want us to, and you'd have some great insight here, is how can we really think about how those best practices and success stories are shared, and then how LEAs work with each other to replicate and expand.
So I feel like my idea for this is not captured in the LEA, and I think this is something to think about. There are a lot of charters that are so strong in their ability to like innovate and teach students. And as you say, they have great best practices that should be shared out. And I think the same thing is true for DCPS. Okay. But what I see that seems like missing with charters is this umbrella that DCPS has that can be like that base to exchange information. One, with LEAs, the charter LEAs in and of themselves, but then also potentially those two organizations like funneling up to the top. Do you see what I'm saying? I think that when I think about like the special education, even some charters in the single member LEA, public charter schools in particular, that really aren't necessarily able to in-house serve students with a lot of IEPs. I think about that structure, that structure and that support potentially being created to help with that issue as well. So that potentially there could be a lot more partnership between the public charter schools, and I think that the stronger that system is, the more likely you'll get more communication and more partnering between DCPS and charters.
And I know I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves because this is an idea that isn't fully formed yet. It's a need that's been identified. But does something like that in your mind exist best at the Deputy Mayor for Education's office, or at OSSI's office, or at the Public Charter School Board, along with the DCPS central office, or it's just really unclear?
I have no idea.
Okay.
That's
fair.
Yeah.
That's why I'm from the board. I don't think it's that above. I do think it's that above, but that's not what I'm asking. But it does. But the mayor controls all of those systems. If anyone does, that's where it has to come from. It has to come from that above. And it's got to be verbalized and in writing. But it's got to be a strong presentation about the need, because there's an incredibly obvious need, and there are ways to solve the problem.
I also think that it's important to note that there, for instance, for special education, there are workshops that extend across sectors. There are monthly meetings that happen where staff members from all different sectors, different LEAs come together and they share. And they have there's a citywide system for special education. It's theirs. And so they come together, they talk about that system, and they talk about how they can share practices. So this type of sharing isn't particularly new. It's just
How to expand it.
how to expand it and how to strengthen it.
How to publicize.
Hold on, I just want to get, so I've got Jessica, I've got Kieran, I've got
So I just tweeted out to all the SPED advocates in the city that they need to read your report and talk about it. But one question I have for you is, and I sent you an email to me to talk about a bunch of things, but one question I have is, how can we best help advance these recommendations, make connections for the Ombudsman's office? How do we, as board members in our wards or throughout the city, how do we help you get this in front of people? Who would it be helpful to you to get this in front of? How do we help advance it?
So thank you for the tweet. I think that's step one. Yeah.
Something for each Twitter. I don't know if they'll all reach Twitter tonight, but some of them will.
But I think specifically around RTI, I think that's a conversation that we need to have more with school principals, administrators, leaders, and parents. Quite frankly, I think most parents don't know what RTI is. I think we've talked about this in meetings before. They don't know what RTI is, and there's often sort of this jump between my child isn't performing well, and I think that my child needs special education services, and it's like, wait, there are actually so many other things that you could potentially do, and maybe would want to do if you knew they existed, right? So I think it's more about making sure that people are informed. Honestly, I think talking to OSCE, talking to city leaders about even asking them to read the report would be helpful, even as a baseline. And what I wrote sort of as a kind of like a preamble introduction into the conversation on RTI is really to say that this is not Office of the Ombudsman thinks that this is it, like, right, like just take this, adopt this, and implement it as is. I want it to be analyzed. I want it to be criticized. I want people to share what their best practices are and how this really should be developed and evolved as a city. And yes, all of that. Okay. So I think sort of that first step is to ask more questions to our city, to our school leadership team, and also to ask questions of parents, even like around when you hear parents. I don't know, when you go to meetings, if parents are complaining around like academic progress issues, and asking them, well, what kind of supports or interventions have been used with your child? Because I bet most parents aren't thinking that they have been, and maybe they have been, or maybe they haven't, right? So, but it helps to get them thinking about possibilities. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Karen?
Just to kind of answer the question, but being a special education teacher in DCPS, when I was doing that, I got a lot of requests from charter schools, and I had to work with charter schools. Charter school now came to the DCPS school for intervention, and the thing that I saw that worked with my children was the constant intervention and the constant assessment. Because you might have to hit the same issue 25 times before the child grasps it and understands it. So it was a constant assessment, but the assessments were fun. I mean, you made it interesting, and the child became interested in it, and it became a game. And when they finally grasped it, we tested it the 99th time, and they finally grasped it, it was the best feeling in the world. So it's a really good program. This is how to implement it. And my point is that charters and DCPS have been working on this issue for a long time.
They haven't.
But they haven't solved the problem.
Yeah. And one of my favorite quotes from my childhood pastor was, "Teaching is repetition until learning takes place." That's what RTI is. Like, it is. It's repetition until learning takes place.
Emily?
Right. So actually, I have sort of the same question as Jessica, but I guess I will build on it, and also what Fraser suggested about the mayor. First, when you were saying that, it's like, no, we don't want it to be this top-down thing, because we do need the people, as you pointed out, it's going to take all hands on deck in terms of the education world, right? I guess I'm curious if you could speak more about that. Like, what do you mean by it's going to take everyone? Is it a matter of better communication, better understanding,
Buy-in.
and so
Yeah. Why it should be citywide? I mean, our office, our staff, particularly actually Stephanie and Ravel, they go, and Montreal, they've gone to like the OSCE training, the RTI training, learning about positive behavioral supports. Like, there's a lot of training that already exists for these things, and there are tons of trainings that OSCE is doing on RTI. I think that part of the question is, the city knows that that this is worth investing in. I don't think that's the sell. I think the question is, why are they holding it back? Do you know what I mean? I don't know the answer to that, but I haven't talked to them about it. I haven't talked to them about it.
So it's maybe trying to get at that Is it capacity? Is it
Maybe.
lack of communication?
Maybe, maybe. But again, I think that it doesn't work if Aussie's not interested. If again, DCPS actually they have an RTI program, but is their RTI program how is it similar or dissimilar from some of the charters who have a robust RTI program? What are the research-based interventions that DCPS is using that could be really great for some of the charters, right? How do we get on the same page with that? And I think that it goes back to Jack's question around how do we get people to talk to each other and want to work together to make it a citywide thing,
Is there a role for the mayor in prioritizing that?
You have to ask the mayor.
Well, the mayor
have to
would
do
be
the deputy mayor.
I just had a question about, so on the topic of the special education service offerings, had you thought about whether or not it would be helpful for parents for schools to list, or LEAs to list even the non-public placements they use? And then, if so, how valuable would it be to come up with an assessment of quality for those non-public placements?
I hadn't thought about it, to be honest. I will say, more often, recently, within the last couple of months, we've been getting more parents who literally they want to stay in the DCPS public school system. They don't want to go to a non-public placement, especially a non-public placement that's located outside of the district, and they're trying to figure out how to work the lottery in order to actually get into the school that they want to and just have the students stay there. I haven't really received a lot of complaints or any that come to mind, and feel free to chime in if you have heard differently, of parents who question the robustness or quality of service in the non-public placement schools per se. It may have been, it's just not the type of educational structure that they're looking for their child.
Yeah, the only reason I asked was just because of that very specific news story where there was this non-public placement being run out of a house on Minnesota Avenue. And so I'm just thinking about how, publicly available the information about where we're sending our students to special needs.
Yeah.
There is so for the process to get a non-public placement, the LEA goes really back to Aussie. The Aussie sits in on a meeting, and the team, the MDT determines where it goes. And so there is a list of approved LEAs. In fact, we had a case where there was a non-public placement that was on the approved list who no longer is. So there is already an approved list, and what we have seen in the cases is, and let's also be frank, that some parents want a non-public placement. Some parents are seeking a non-public placement, and so what we have seen is not so much about the robustness of the program, but I've researched this program, and I want my child to go to this specific school for this specific reason that I've researched. So it's really on the front end having a specified school that they want to go to for whatever reason.
Gotcha. And so you're thinking that this, I guess the recommendation was most motivated because folks just want to know where there's available in-house supports more than anything.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to make a comment? So I have a question and comment. So you talked a little bit about some of the schools that have RTI programs. And so what is your sense of do you have a sense of the extent to which how many LEAs have them and the extent to which they get implemented?
Yeah, I have no idea. We have started to get, actually Ravel was just telling me about a school who called and said that they wanted to start an RTI program at their school, but they had no idea where to start, and they didn't yet have them.
So let me just, and this is, I was going to do this in my leadership report, but I'll do it now. So I spent 8 hours at the council for their dyslexia hearing. I think some other people listened to it online, and a lot of that was about RTI. So RTI, on the one hand, can be at all the different grades as you show, but it's also very explicit and specific for early reading, and the idea being if you have the right whole class instruction, not that many kids will have to go to tier 2, and if tier 2 is good, not that many kids will have to go to tier 3. And there were, I think, I forget, 50, 60, 80, I forget the number of people there talking about the ways in which that had not happened in their school. And so what happened is the RTI was not in place,
Right.
and kids weren't getting identified for special ed. And so that was a problem. Or kids would get identified for special ed because it was the only way to get them services, when in fact, and that's part of what you're saying, they didn't need to be in special ed. They needed to get someone to help them with early reading.
Right.
So I say all of that to say I think there's a huge interest at the council on this, because at the end of the day, the government witnesses talking, the council was very clear that they wanted to do something.
Right.
So I think there's interest. It's a specific part of the RTI, and it might be, or might not be, but it might be that there's a lot of reason to try to figure out how to converge and coalesce on that piece as sort of a starting point. But I think there is a lot of interest there. So, well, I would early, reading K2, I guess, just so that ideally you would identify a lot of students through the RTI. And
I think there was another bill also by Adam, the part, okay. But I think there's another bill, and I can try to find it, and you might know, I'm not sure, sorry, don't mean to put you on the spot, where they take the park score, which park can be a universal screener, right? And the students, I think, who were scoring 2 or below would be automatically potentially enrolled in intervention, like an intervention type program. But I think that what you're talking about, the dyslexia bill, like essentially the test for dyslexia, whatever that assessment is, that would become a universal screener. That's what they're asking for. So yes, it seems like there is a lot of interest around RTI and specifically with that bill around like the reading portion. And there also seems to be other bills and interest in early intervention in general when it comes to academic success and academic progress and helping
separate from that.
Yeah.
I think, and also to speak to the first part of your question of, is there an idea of what do schools have it or not? I really think when we think about RTI, it's not so much of who has it and who doesn't. Because some people have an RTI program, but it's vastly different depending on the school or the neighborhood or the sector. And so we have schools, the district has schools that are just trying to implement it. We have schools like Ketchum that at a certain time of the day they stop everything and do interventions. And so it's not a hard cutoff of a yes or no. It's really about where on the spectrum are schools.
So your point is that there should be a policy that would apply across all the LEAs and schools. Here's a list of screeners. Here's the time during, every child should get it in whatever grade. Here's how you would do interventions. My suggestion would be, at least one piece of it is to be tracking very closely what the council is doing and see if there's some ways we can support that with sort of knowledge that you have from your experience. Because I think they're going to be looking to figure out a plan. Maybe they'll work with the DAB. But I think it would be great to have. I think it would be great to have such a program in the city, and then how we can help make that happen. I think it's less. But we have good information, and we have good advocates. So, all right. Other. Everyone else?
Thank you.
Madam President, if I could suggest a 5-minute break for resetting. Thank you. Members, I need you at the wall over here, please. Office student advocates, you guys want to come up and we can get the PowerPoint reloaded.
Matt? This one.
Looks like stand up. Looks like stand up.
Very trustee.
Oh, you need to turn it on. Wait, so unplug this and then plug it back in. Unless it's dead. In which case, Alex can charge it. You charge it halfway.
Is it starting already? I'm gonna get another extension cord. Can we tell them this is starting already?
I have an orange rolling here. I've got
Yes. Can you put that chair?
but my cell phone is orange. It's always orange.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. All right, so everyone just looking at me.
Okay, I was doing Ed first or me?
Ladies.
Wait, big smiles, friends.
Big
Big
smile.
smiles.
Thank you. I can imagine how hopefully that smile will
I forgot about that.
Yes. No problem. Well, I want to make sure to do it now. Thank you. Did we also, ready? Just want to make sure there's sound out of it. Sure.
It's showing right there, but it still has a original. It's not advancing on this thing. The higher. Yeah, it clicks there. That thing on. So no one coming from this.
Do you need a copy? Real. When you're ready.
I didn't gavel out.
It's all
All
right.
right. Okay, gaveling us back in for a report from the student advocate's office. Okay.
They should have it in there in the packets, yeah. Yes, they do.
Evening, everyone. So this past school year, 18-19, OSA went through a change of the year. Our founding chief student advocate, Vic Gibson Hubbard, moved on to the mayor's 5x5 council, and he's going to be there. And I have stepped up from the student advocate role into the chief student advocate role, and we have added a new staff change. So Philip Copeland was a fellow and is now a student advocate. Malcolm Mandrell, who was at intermediate prep and was a fellow at one point in their career, is now back as a program associate. And we are hitting the ground running. So we're going to kind of get into it. I think for the most part, you guys know what we do day in and day out. And so we're going to hop into the numbers. So This past year, we had a total outreach contact of 6,750 contacts, and that is people that have received our information. So, discipline guides, the OSA go-to guides, the family material go-to guide, as well as that information in multiple different languages. In addition to that, around half of those contacts, around 3,300 of those were face-to-face contacts. So those are contacts where someone from the community met with us, talked to us, and actually had an exchange. In addition to that, we also had we operated our RFA hotline, where we had received 758 calls. 251 of those calls occurred outside of our normal operating hours. Our general policy for those calls are to call those people back and to follow up as much as possible. With that, though, we engaged successfully with 507 families. We have the way we kind of categorize our contacts are RFAs, and so there's 4 main RFAs. That's kind of where we traditionally always see our topics and where families are seeking for help. Those areas around enrollment access, special ed, student safety, and academic instructions. And so one of the things that I've noticed looking at some of our past reports out, I don't think we've ever actually told what those things mean for us. And so we want to make sure you guys understood kind of what those things mean. In addition to that, with those 4 main topics, there are 8 other topics. So we have a total of 12 topics where an RPA will come in and we'll categorize that on one of those topics, from anything from academic instruction to enrollment access, to health and wellness, to language access. With that, we break that information down, categorize that into around 21 different co-occurring topics or co-occurring things that can occur for our family, and that's kind of how we capture our information, capture our data. And this past year, in our fourth year being operational, we continue to grow. We had a 19% increase from our previous year. From year 1, when we opened the business, we have a 276% increase in calls. So we're continuing at that clip of steady growth. Again, this is kind of a breakdown by where families are calling from, where they are at, as far as where they live. We break this down later on into slides by where families are selecting schools and by sector and choice. But again, Ward 8 is the leader in our people seeking our services, then followed by Ward 7, then closely by Ward 5. Ward 6 is also highly represented as well. The past 2 years, we added race. This year, we added race, and we were able to kind of do a little bit more analysis with our data, and we were able to kind of talk about race by our topics. So, in addition to serving the majority black population, we're steadily working on serving other communities of color, as well as serving other residents in the district. But when we break down, our African American families and people that identify as black, there are the four main categories that kind of came up that we talked about at the beginning: special ed, disability, student safety, enrollment access, and academic instructions were the four leaders. With that, when we delved deep into that, bullying, IEPs, and special education placement were the secondary topics that kind of occurred in those instances. For our white and non-Hispanic families, again, special education, disability, enrollment access, student safety, and academic instruction kind of held true for both our black families and our white families. The secondary topics shifted a little bit. IEPs, individual education plans led, followed by documentation and special ed placement and bullying were tied for the third secondary topics that parents were bringing issues to, or raising concerns about. For our Latinx and Hispanic identifying families, we had a shift in the top 4. Enrollment access was number 1, abuse and neglect, special education, disability, and academic instructions. The secondary concerns were around school choice and the lottery, IEPs, and documentation. Again, DCPS by far is leading the way as in the families that we're engaging with. About a quarter of our calls are coming from families that are connected to charter schools and charter LEAs. 4% of our families came from folks that were unenrolled or not associated with an LEA. This year we started to collect data by grade band. We don't have a lot of information by like topic and which thing, but that's something that we're working on this year to kind of codify. Again, as we're saying, as we're going through all this data, I want folks to know that we're doing this through Excel. We don't have access to QuickBase or Salesforce or another type of, so this is all kind of hard data by hand, counting and making sure things are right. So referrals to our office, how people have gotten a hold of us has been internet research, SBOE referral, and Ombudsman referral. We're very proud of kind of our word of mouth contact that's kind of coming up before. That's parents telling other parents or school leaders telling other folks saying, hey, this is a resource that you should reach out for. But majority of folks are finding us through our internet presence. So all of the stuff that we're putting on our website, all the stuff that you're seeing on your social media accounts and stuff like that has really been driving traffic to our hotline. Kind of what we're doing with these cases, what we're doing with these families. For the majority of families, they're being connected to resources and information. There are some families that are being provided coaching, and so coaching is a little bit more of a longer-term engagement where we're providing kind of strategies and providing advice, saying, hey, these are your best next steps, and here are the things that are here are your options, and here are the most likely options that will occur in this situation. In addition to that, referrals and the way our office provides referrals are person-to-person referrals. So if someone calls our office and says, I'm having an issue at XYZ school, we're going to connect that referral to a person at XYZ school. So there's not just here's the number to the student engagement office, here's the number to the special ed coordinator, but here we're doing a direct person-to-person connection. So there's a substantial follow-up process for us in making sure families are connected to someone that's going to be able to hold their hand. Lastly, in intervention for us is us going beyond generally our 5 steps and doing some type of advocacy for that family or for that parent. This is a little bit. I'm pretty sure it's not visible. It's probably some of the topic areas are probably hard to read on the sheet. So on the topic areas on the sheet, one of the things, again, the same things that kind of led the way: special ed, student safety, and enrollment and access. Where again, those 4 main characters are part of the areas where families across all wards, across all kind of demographics are saying, this is where we need support, this is where we need help.
Can you clarify enrollment? Is that like navigating lottery? Is that
so that's everything from navigating. That's everything. So enrollment for us is everything from navigating the lottery and getting into the building. And so sometimes So sometimes an access for us is literally access to the building, access to the place you want to be. So a lot of times we'll have enrollment access issues as well as special ed placement issues, or we'll have enrollment access issues as well as language access issues or attendance issues, and then we'll see attendance issues and enrollment access issues later on in the school year around March, when letters are distributed to families saying, all right, due to attendance, you're being uninvited to or not invited to enroll next year. Kind of broken down because we know these are these issues that show up all the time, and we want to make sure folks understand where these things are showing up and how what's happening with these things. So when we look at enrollment access issues, the things that's coming up a lot is the My School, navigating the My School lottery. Next, it's pre-K3 and pre-K4 issues. And then that's followed equally by documentation, medical issues, and transfer requests. Again, in our data, when we look at special ed placements and IEP are leading the way as far as concerns for families. When we take a look at student safety, bullying by far is majority of our calls is around 60%. When we talk about student safety, again, transfer requests is the next thing that leads up to that.
Can I ask one more
Yes.
clarifying question? Documentation is like showing where you're that you're a resident, or what?
So documentation kind of fluctuates. It's generally when we see documentation, the school is asking for paperwork from that family that they don't have right away.
Whatever.
Right. So in enrollment access, documentation could be residency requirement information. Documentation for special disability, it could be documentation that supports a 504 intervention or 504 accommodation. By school ward, so again, Ward 8 schools, RFAs that are referred to. So this is essentially saying these are RFAs that are in reference to a school location. So schools in Ward 8, 26% were around 26% were concerns. Ward 6 schools were around 21%. Ward 7 schools were around 16%, and Ward 5 schools were around 14%. Next slide, we were able to, the next several slides, I'm going to be talking about kind of schools, breakdown by sector and breakdown by residency and by primary topic. And so this may be a time where folks want to look at the sheet and kind of find out, hey, this is my ward, this is where what's happening in my area. We try to kind of provide that information. I think in the past, folks have asked for that, and we weren't really able to break that down during the quarter data because it's easy to match up, but for yearly data, we're able to provide that. So, again, in Ward 1, this breaks down the sectors that we're receiving calls from. And then on the right-hand side, breaks down what those topics are for Ward 1. Again, it looks like Ward 1, student safety. I should look at the screen because I can't read on my student safety, enrollment access, and special ed. Again, it's very similar to the same four categories that have cut across the city. In Ward 2, we had I'll be honest, the N in Ward 2 is very low. The issues that populated for Ward 2, again, were student safety and enrollment access. Special ed disability was around 14%. But with the N being so low, we're talking a handful of cases. Ward 3, there's a much more equalization of the pie concerns, much more equal. Again, Ward 3 doesn't have any charter LEAs in place, but there are families coming from outside of the ward, certainly going to schools in Ward 3. Ward 4, special ed disability was by far the issue that was dominating, followed by enrollment access. And 5, again, special ed disability, and then enrollment access. 6, student safety led the way with special ed disability following, and enrollment access also, I think, was tied for enrollment access as well. Seven, special ed disability again. 8 was a more student safety. So we can have more in-depth conversations about what this data means and kind of how we can break this down to get a more unique look for you individually. But that was something that was asked for in the past, and we want to make sure that was provided this year. We talk about our public engagement data. We have a little bit of a skew from our engagement from last year. This year we categorized this past year we participated in DCPS's career connection fairs. Not career connections, connection spares for the students. So we spent a lot of time in DCPS buildings and DCPS settings. So that is kind of skewing our engagement data where we have 40% with government stakeholder engagement. But that was student-facing events for DCPS. So again, we break down like where we were meeting and how we were connecting with people. 38% of our actions were community events, and the other 60% were in-person meetings. So that's us being out in the evening, being out in the weekend, making ourselves available to talk to families where they are. Again, this talks a little bit more about face-to-face contacts, giving that into what we just described. One of the things that we were kind of more proud about was the source about distributing resources, and so we've got to make sure we got our English discipline guide. 1,300 of those were distributed today, or so far. The English go-to guide, 5,000 of those were distributed today, and the Spanish go-to guide, around 450 of those have been distributed. The discipline guide is really cool because we only got those back, I believe, in April. So up until then they were all online, and now we were putting those in person, getting those out to the community as needed. So that was our data. That was kind of our general what we've done this year. We have a lot of recommendations on things that we want to see happen. As far as safe passage, we really want to be this year. We participated with the DME of creating several initiatives to kind of create safe, student-led and student-facing safety initiatives. One of those things is safe spots. We would love to see the expansion of safe spots into areas besides Ward 8. We are currently engaged with the DME, recruiting new spaces in Ward 5 and Ward 7 for additional safe spots. One of the things now is that safe passage has become a very much government-centric effort. We would like to see more CBO involvement, more community involvement. In places where we have seen it be successful, it hasn't been governmental. We talk about the Chicago models and the Oakland models. Those are models where government is there to support, and there are places where those things are working outside of government. There's a lot of conversation about who should own safe passage. Our stance is that we've stood up the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. We would love to put more support there, more resources there to kind of expand that work. We know that the office is new and they're still growing, but and we believe the end place for kind of safe passage and kind of where students and families should be looking for support and schools should be looking for support is in the one's office. Lastly, we are, as far as safe passage, we are concerned about we wanted to create this is more of a finance guide recommendation, is to create that creating an additional after support or wait for families that are homeless. So schools can provide transportation assistance for families that are in shelter, and particularly the families that are in the New York Avenue temporary shelter scatter sites. Bullying, at this point in our effort in the city's efforts to combat bullying, we've done one part of the work as far as creating a framework and creating laws to support families and to support students that are experiencing bullying. But we haven't put in the other part of that. We haven't put in the resources to make that training universal and to make it where we need it to be. So we're asking for more school staff training resources to support that. We're asking for more inclusive programming that isn't just putting the onus on a person that's in the building. That it's going with school support staff training for all members in the building. Generally, right now, there's one person that's designated as the bullying point of contact, and that person is trained. We would love to see everyone in the building trained to be able to support families dealing with bullying, students dealing with bullying, as well as more robust adherence to the Youth Bullying and Prevention and Implementation Support Act. there are several things that have been put forth in the act that are yet to really be actualized. A lot of that is, most of that is LEAs not necessarily reporting out, providing that data to OHR as needed. Special education, there are several things that we really want to see happen. Just in general, there needs to be an increased access as far as how we talk about special education and how we make sure education information is put out there. We really need to make sure information is available about what LEAs are offering. I think Serena may have mentioned this in some of her recommendations, but there are places that we have, such as the My School DC platform and the state report card, where we can list out things that will give it indicators that will say this is indicators for families, so they can know they're selecting a school that has the supports and the resources in place to support their student. One of the other things that's kind of been very keen on us was for in addition to providing information about what the school is offering, what information is available for after school program and what the capacity is and what is available after school for those students that have individualized supports. Right now, there's nothing in place that says an after-school provider has to provide the same accommodations for a student that has an IEP. And generally, those students are usually just either barred from, some people will get barred due to behavior problems from participating in after-school activities, or will have to, if they're in a placement situation, wouldn't be able to have access to it because they're catching the bus to go back home. We're in full support of the response to intervention framework standards. I think I don't get into detail in the Serena's recommendations, but one of the things that is true is that RTI has done very much school to school, community to community. There's some folks that do it well, then there are some folks that don't do it at all. And part of that is being able to communicate with each other. I think we have the framework and we have the things in place for SLED to be in compliance with our IDA obligations. We don't have that for anything else. Lastly, several years ago we passed the Special Education Procedural Protections Expansion Act, and that hasn't been implemented, or folks are not school building and school leaders aren't fully aware of what that means for them. I believe so. Part of that is we created this right for parents to make verbal and auditory requests for services. The school leaders still aren't honoring those things as actual services. They're not starting the clock, or not starting services when requested verbally. Student discipline. Again, we need improved communication around what the Secure Access to School Amendment Act is. There's a lot of confusion around what that's going to mean as far as what's going to happen in my school building and how it's going to keep my child safe, or what's going to happen to me as a teacher, and when an incident occurs. It'll be great to improve that communication, improve the framework, and communicating what is happening with that. Lastly, we've made this recommendation before. We will continue to make this recommendation. Is that we need a state level advisory panel for school discipline at the OSCE level, and that's essentially, we have that for early education, we have it for special education, but we don't have it for school discipline, and it's an opportunity for folks, parents and school leaders, to communicate about what things are working, what things aren't working. Again, we also are making a recommendation that schools adopt school discipline advisory committees. We have LSAT teams where we talk about school budgets, but we don't. This is an opportunity where we talk about school climate and culture, and really talk about what's happening in that school building as far as around discipline. And lastly, alternative instruction policies. There are DCPS does this well, and they have Chapter 25, but there are other schools and other LEAs that don't list out this policy at all, or list out what's the framework for when a student is on suspension notice or removed from the classroom, what their instructional rates are. lastly, as far as recommendations, is teacher representation. We want LEAs to report out data talking about teachers as far as their certification status, where their prep program was, where they're coming from, their demographic information, including race and ethnicity and language proficiency. We believe this information can be listed on the STAR framework. It can be listed on that report card. For us, representation is tied to student discipline and is tied to student achievement. As we look at in your folders, and there's a whole in the blue folders that we provided, there's a whole section on teacher representation and kind of how that's linked to positive outcomes and negative outcomes for Black boys and Black and brown children. And lastly, we want to see pathways created to expand the teacher candidate pool, be that through dual enrollment programs, be that through pipelines where folks are being recruited and targeted to come to the teaching profession that are in the city, as well as creating grants to support that. Where we are now for this school year, where we're kind of continuing the work from before, is we're doing a lot of safe passage work. In Ward 4, we are connecting and having conversations around bus routes. We're supporting UDOT to create more walkability improvements. In Ward 5, we're bringing safe spots in the NOMA area, as well as looking for small business and churches to provide that safe haven for students during crisis. In Ward 7, we've started to have conversations around strategies to reduce community violence and how that's impacting schools. Beginning to have these early conversations around bus frequency, and what that means for overcrowding, and what that means in Ward 7, as well as advocating for additional crossing guards and DDOT supports. In Ward 8, we're expanding our awareness. We're trying to expand our awareness of existing initiatives. So the safe spots, Car for the School, the Live Safe app, as well as creating solutions in parts of the ward outside of historic iconic sites and Acosta. Lastly, we're a huge supporter and fans of the Man the Block initiative, and we're supporting that expansion into the common sites. Currently, we are working to create some pipelines, and we have been conversations with Howard, American, Georgetown, and UEC about creating more pipelines for dual enrollment programs and expanding the way we do dual enrollment to have teacher prep tracks. Essentially, it is repurposing programs that are already available to create a more intentional pipeline of students that are from the city that are ready to be teachers after 4 years. We're also moving forward with the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Initiative to create workshops around student fair access to school act, and providing information to families as well as teachers and other school-facing officials. Again, we're continuing our special ed series. We're doing that. We love to do that in conjunction with you guys. We're doing that very soon in Ward 1 as well as in some other places. And we're continuing that work. We're beginning to push forth some information around mental health and bullying, and so that's still in the process. It's still being sorted out, but we're doing a lot of research around there. And lastly, we are in the process of, we're in the process of making sure our teacher representation toolkit is kind of auto ready and ready to ship out. That is us.
Thank you. Questions? Discussion?
I have a couple. I'll start off with a statement. The strain that flows throughout the recommendations continues to be one of non-compliance by all levels of LEAs. Is that a fair statement?
I would say in certain areas there's non-compliance, but I think there's in other areas there's just a lack of information.
Well, okay.
I wouldn't say it's a local non-compliance where folks are coming with knows that what they're supposed to be doing.
Okay, I'll change it to be one of not informing.
I can agree with that.
That was just a statement. A couple of questions. Do you get any calls on the recordings that are like 911 kinds of calls? The ones that you get overnight.
Oh no. So
Okay, that no one's fine. Does the fact that there are small percentages of ELL responders have anything to do with the fact that they don't know how to find you?
I think there's truth to that. I think one of the part of our mission, part of our efforts this year is to be more intentional with reaching out to the English learning communities.
Because you've got Latinx as a group, but I know that in Ward 1 and Ward 4 that there's a high minority of Amharic speakers, and I know we don't have anything, we haven't gotten to the fact that the brochures are in Amharic, right?
So we do have that information. Our
But
information.
I haven't ever seen.
I can make sure we get
No,
that.
I'd like if you can get me some. Yeah,
Our connection is available on, but again, our connection and our connectivity to that community has been limited because there's a disconnect between who we are as a government, as an outside government agency, and us being available to provide support and provide resources. I think that's.
And I noticed that you had a lot about social media stuff, but there are a lot of parents in low-income areas that don't really connect on social media. So it's really not a way to, they do and they don't, right? But as far as finding out like information from government agencies and things like that, that's not on their Facebook. They're not Facebook friends with government agencies. Let me put it that way. And you said that you're connecting and improving bus routes in Ward 4. Because I mean that's a sore point with me in Ward 4 because we have feeder schools for Ida B. Wells, the new middle school, and from Brightwood and from LaSalle Bacchus, there's been no help from anybody, from the mayor's office down, to provide buses to take students from those areas to get to Ida B. Wells. Now, how have you, and maybe I don't know, has there been
Oh no, we have not
cured
solved
that?
We have not solved that hornet's nest. But what we have done is begin the process of documenting that. So I think times schools have been successful with advocating with Metro and Ramada to have improved bus access and to ease overcrowding or ease having any type of route is a long process of making sure things are being documented as far as these buses aren't missing or these buses aren't connecting at the same time. That would get our students there.
We were trying to get a dedicated bus like they have to go to Deal from Ward 4. But there hasn't been any positive result. He says you missed it. Okay, thank you.
I have a few questions. I would love to just rattle them off and you can feel free to tackle them. It's like three, which are fairly simple. One, which Serena, feel free to chime in as well. I didn't ask, I was going to ask. So it seems like from both offices, there's been an increase in people reaching out to the office, which is a great thing. It means, in my assessment, more families see your office as a resource. the question is there any measurement, or how are you measuring like satisfaction, or whether parents or families are feeling as though their needs were met? The context for that is, I think you know, Serena, there have been times where a parent may him me up in a school or in a community meeting and say, oh, I reached out to the office and I know you're not able to give me information about their situations. And so just how are you measuring satisfaction? That's one question. Secondly, are these numbers single cases, or do they also capture people that may be calling back a second time if they are feeling as though their situation wasn't satisfactorily addressed, if that's correct? Third is in the Latinx portion, you mentioned abuse and neglect. And I'm just curious, it's not in the category definition, and just I can imagine what that means, but if you can just expound on what that definition of abuse and neglect means. And then lastly, there was a last thing.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop at those three. So satisfaction, are there double counts, and then what is meant by abuse and neglect?
Okay. So satisfaction, we do not really have a measure to kind of capture satisfaction. When we do give referrals, we are providing emails and kind of we do follow-up emails with that to make sure that referral occurred. But as far as with that, referrals are around 16 to 20% of our resolution. Most of the information that we're giving to families is occurring within 5 contacts of our office. Now, as far as repeat callers or single instances, the only time a family is counted more than one time is if they're calling about separate issues. So if they call at one point and say, hey, I'm having issues with my 8th grade son at XYZ school, then they'll call back a month later, a week later, or whatever later, and say, I'm having issues with my other child at CDE school.
Is that the same?
Yeah, we have the same one.
As far as abuse and neglect, one of the things that we've been more intentional about capturing this year were instances of families being receiving reprisal or essentially being retaliated by school officials for reporting. And so I believe anytime we hear CFSA and that is the main concern, we'll categorize that as abuse and neglect. So that was one of the things that was I believe there was a certain outlier that was doing more reporting around families in that community than not.
Gotcha. And if I could just ask one quick follow-up, is it safe to assume that your offices are the last step a parent has in the district if they have an issue?
I don't think people usually get to us because they look to other places. I'm not sure certainly we're the last step, but we're probably the step where they're most frustrated at.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's true. And to answer some of the other questions that also apply to our office, we don't have like a satisfaction measure or survey, in part because our goal isn't necessarily to make parents satisfied, right? It is to sort of work with them into like what's in the best interest of students, probably. But also, there's only so much we can do in certain situations, particularly if a policy exists but the school follows the policy. But we can still work on communicating, even if that's something that the parents want or like are interested in. But it's the school actually did exactly what they're supposed to. Sometimes we have to be the ones to deliver them. I will say that on the case closing, so you didn't quite ask this question, but it is related. So we have changed our policy to make it more explicit as to when you close the case. Before, what was happening at times is there would be an instance where we work with the family, we work with the school, there was some kind of documentation that we were told was going to be provided. Because that step was supposed to be taken by the other person and there was nothing else that we could do, then we went ahead and closed down and let the parent know that they're supposed to receive this thing. Now, sometimes it comes back because it got left on someone's desk and we forgot to put it in the mail. So now what we do is we hold our cases a little bit longer to make sure we'll follow up with the school, we'll follow up with the
these are really comprehensive recommendations. If you were gonna prioritize them, where would you want help from board members in advancing some of these?
For us, I think the thing that would be the most impactful for families, that we needed the most, would be around supporting our homeless families. I believe they're kind of, time and time again, they are kind of left out of the process, and there's a lot of things happening to them without their input and without the kind of agency or focus. So we need support that can be put towards homeless families or families that are in shelter sites. I think that is where support is needed.
Awesome, thank you.
To that point around the support for homeless families, around your recommendation around transportation, I'm assuming these are at shelter sites like the ones on New York Avenue that have limited access to metro and things like that. Okay. And then in terms of assistance for our Latinx families, I noticed there's a high percentage for enrollment and access. Is that usually like language barriers with navigating the system? Is it documentation more?
So it's not necessarily language barrier, but more so documentation. A lot of families that are recent immigrants, to actually anyone that's new to the city, aren't necessarily able to navigate the national DC lottery. And two, it becomes, not in where the charter school that's next to you is not your neighborhood school, is one of the kind of key things for us. In addition to enrollment access, there's several times when students will come with transcripts from their home country, bringing it into coming to BCS to get evaluated, whatever school they want to enroll in, and there being challenges there.
And are you seeing in particular a disparity in terms of discipline calls across sectors at all?
Disparity as far as
in terms of kind of the amounts of complaints between the public sector and the charter sector.
No.
Oh, and I just want to also thank you for the work that your team has been really doing for it around safe passage. That has taken a whole life of its own, and especially the work you're doing with our student leaders who are really leading that conversation. Really valuable. So thank you for that.
Okay, my comment. So I really have a version really with Jessica's question, which is what should we advocate for, can we advocate for? I'm going to come at it in a different way, which is sort of the things that are in that list that seem like things we could do something about. And so this is really a question of the board as well. But it does strike me, and this is partly to Jean Paul, to Jeff, to Karen, who were very involved in this, is it does seem like what you want is to make sure some issues get on the report card. Teacher representation, the programs and the special ed programs available at schools. So it does seem like that should be something that we could put together a list of recommendations that we would send to OSSI to ask them to become part of the report card.
I'm unclear what you think I said.
No, I'm just saying that there were under the ESSA task force, there was a lot of discussion about the report cards. So I'm wondering. So I'm just sort of appealing to the expertise of folks who participate in that, to how we would go about. Maybe there's a sensitivity to that we could put together a few of these things into a letter to OSSI.
Have you had conversations with OSSI about the recommendations on adding these to this?
So not in regards to the school report card, we've had some conversations around some of the other recommendations, more particularly the teacher information.
I mean, we certainly can. I mean, I don't know if you guys want to approach that subject first, or however we can help, of course.
Yeah, so I think I'm of the mind as far as with the school report card, the more the merrier. The more information that we can put on there, the more information families are able to take away, and it's also great for schools to be able to say, hey, this is a strong point for us.
So is there a consensus on that? That would be a worthy thing for us to put together a letter on and send it on?
Is the information that we're asking for also then aligned with the statewide data warehouse bill that the board has adopted as well? Because some of that information is also supposed to be on the
Well, the representation piece could be.
So there's definitely some overlap with the statewide, with the statewide warehouse. The data.
Yeah.
There's definitely some overlap there as far as information you're seeing from teachers.
Great.
The TNTP report
Oh, yeah.
that came out from us and provided a lot of information, a lot of clarity on some of the things that were out there. But in particular, I think when I was recently was at Zach's meeting at Achievement Prep, and we were at another school recently, Statesman Academy, and we were kind of saying that the representation in that building is a plus. And that's something that's not on the report card for folks that want that. There are places that have representation, that have staff, that are putting work and putting intentionality in there. That's kind of not being taken into account. So I think that's something that should be weighted. That should be shared.
On that issue, I just want to point out that DC is arguably the most information in the country on our school report card. We've been very deliberate about what's gone on there and made sure that we work with OSSI to put as much information as possible, to the point that it's still helpful to parents. At some point, there is a law of diminishing returns where sticking additional information on that doesn't have a real thought process behind it and a designated outcome that's sort of fact-based can sort of lead to people getting confused and just saying no.
So
I get concerned about that.
the DC report card has a lot of student-based information and a lot of achievement score type data, but regarding teachers, there's like 2 bullet points that you really get, and it's on the tail latter end of the website. And I feel like teachers are a central part of school culture in general and the school environment. I think the only gauges of school environment on the DC report card are related to suspensions or in-school suspensions of that nature. I think the school's ability to retain their teachers is a good indicator of the school's health itself. And I think also if your ability to, recruit a diverse teaching staff and maintain them and having information regarding if they can speak a second language, that's valuable information for families who speak a second language or navigate English in general. So I feel like those things really should be emphasized and added accessible.
I'd really be interested to see what should come off of the dashboard as well. If there are some trade-offs that we can be making, because not everything can be a priority all the time, or it gets lost, and parents and guardians and decision makers and families get overwhelmed. And we want to make sure that doesn't happen.
So, and the other part too to remember is when we were having those conversations about the report card, it feels like forever ago, but it wasn't that long ago, was it, members? There was a lot of discussion on the teacher stuff and a lot of the information that we saw as a board and talked about what if we could, those types of conversations and sought community input from those. It just isn't collected, so that's one of the other reasons that we're pushing, I think, for that data bill, is because it's not collected at a statewide level. And if it's not collected and isn't validated, then we can't have it on the report card. So there's all those steps that need to come into it too. But it's an interesting concept, I think, too.
Well, so let me divide this maybe into 2 or 3 parts. One is, so we have moving this bill on the teacher data, to be collected in an annual report.
What do you mean moving?
We've submitted it to the city council.
Okay, but the council's not done anything yet.
Correct, we just submitted it, exactly. So, what we could do is make sure that as we promote that bill, as any of us do testimony on it, it's my understanding that Chairman Mendelson is going to hold a hearing on teacher turnover at some point in December, that this issue, which I think is not explicitly, well, I guess it is in the bill, just to make sure that we raise it, it should be on that we believe it should be on the report card, I think would be reviewing. And secondly, in terms of the special ed listings, that's definitely not handled by this, and I wonder if we, should have a I'm sort of looking at you for recommendations. Should we have a letter about it, to sort of say we think this should be on there? Should we have a resolution about that?
That's something that parents have given feedback on. I know PAVE, for instance, it's something that's a priority, maybe not a top priority for them, but they mentioned it. So I think there would be support across the district, especially for the SPED classification information to be on the report card.
Well, she's talking about the program, when
Well, the
Serena was.
offerings, the sped offerings.
Sped offer.
So that parents have that information when they're trying to make a choice. So if I could make a potential suggestion, I mean, you know, I know the task force is done, but if Karen's willing, I'll work with you on some language and talk to Aussie about the directory and see what the appetite is there, and then we can move forward.
Alright, and then, so, just as a timeline, can we bring that up at the next, working meeting? So December, so that
Sure.
have a month to.
Sure, we'll try.
Okay, that would be great, and then also.
I mean, they're in the midst of validation right now for the next update, so.
And then we'll also be a little further along on the, teacher data, and so we might be able to figure out how or if we want to include some of that in the comparable. And the other one that I sort of pulled out of the list of sort of things that seemed very concrete that maybe we could sort of lend some support to was this idea of a statewide discipline advisory committee, which we do have them for a lot of the other issues. And, you know, it's potentially something we have a regular meeting with the superintendent, we could raise it. That won't put it very far, but we could do some, you know, testing of the idea.
I'm confused. Are we making decisions based on the recommendations of the student advocate, but not making decisions based on the ombudsman's recommendations to me?
No, these recommendations cross the two reports.
Sorry, what was the advisory group? I missed.
That one of the recommendations that Dan had was to create a citywide advisory group on discipline issues, comparable to what now exists for special education. I know exists, and I think you named the second one.
Early childhood.
Early childhood.
I wonder if that one actually would be better approached with the deputy mayor's office rather than Aussie, but.
Is that where the other ones are?
No, special ed is staffed through Aussie, but they have special ed components at Aussie. I'm just trying to think of
Well, we could start at Austin. Anyway, and see if there's a, you know, what kind of resonance there might be.
Let me just throw out that the special ed is at OSSI because it's a federal law.
Right.
And the early childhood is at OSSI because it's federally funded and there's federal money behind the subsidy. Whereas the discipline is a council law and signed by the mayor. So maybe there may be a reason for that.
I see. Yeah, that makes total sense. So, and you're talking about it specific to the new law.
Correct. It doesn't have to be section. You're talking about the context of the new law, and the areas that they cover, what you want to discuss does not have to be specific to just the areas that are covered in the law.
You were talking about the homeless. I would like to have a panel soon to happen, public meeting, where maybe you and some other experts might want to talk about, so that we can publicize it, get it out into ether.
Yeah, whenever you guys approve, you know, the agenda and one.
Could you put together a?
So in other words, to have Dan, folks from his staff, and also people that are in that situation, talking about
Either people in the, I don't know,
people from
that
schools who are talking about,
just someone that would be knowledgeable about it.
to give us a better
Could be a
understanding.
community activist or whatever, but just to get it out, because you would provide the information that you gave to us, and then, but I just think that it needs to be out there, because it's big.
Is there any comments, support, ideas on that? Strikes me as an interesting idea.
I do like that idea. I actually think it may be worth dissecting both reports and seeing how we can have panels on it beyond just that one issue. So for instance, the SPED issues, there were many that I think could be worthy conversations. So maybe one of the ways to do this, so we have a regular meeting that actually is supposed to happen on Monday, but it's a holiday, so we're going to shift it. But maybe the three of us can get together and try to figure out the right parts of, and kind of look forward to the future and the timing of things.
Okay.
Will that work?
Would it make sense for recommendations inclusion in our annual report as a baseline to begin those conversations with our partners?
I'm sorry, not following. So
Would it be productive to, once we, I think, come up with the general ones that we want to kind of take up and help advance, would it be helpful to include those as a section in our annual report and then use that as a baseline to begin those conversations?
I think it would probably be better to leave these as standalone from the offices and note the hard work that goes into putting these together. But I think certainly we can look at some of them to make sure to see how they align better. We typically don't do recommendations in our annual report, so it would be a change.
Okay, that's what I've got on this. Okay. Anybody else before we close on that?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, committee reports.
Okay, Alex and I went to a retention workshop in, outside of Baltimore a couple of weeks ago, and it was really, really interesting and very helpful about how different areas are working and trying to help retain teachers, right? Because the fact that we have, we're really talking about the teacher retention. We're going to find out from the survey, and Alex will tell you more about that. We'll definitely have the results by mid-January about why the teachers left in 2017-18 and 2018-2019. So we'll find out, we'll get some information. It probably won't be news, but it'll solidify how we think teachers might leave, rather than for positive reasons that they leave, through promotions or through births or better jobs or whatever. Good stuff. But what we really want to focus on after we get the report is how can we get these systems to provide mechanisms to retain teachers, right? Especially new teachers. And so that's really going to be the push after we get the information. So now we're talking, okay, Alex, help me out with all the information about like MOUs and so forth.
So the teacher retention MOU for soliciting a vendor is going to actually administer the draft survey that was previously developed for us. It's in the final stages, and we hope to know and have that vendor in place potentially by the end of this week, early next week. So that is moving well along. As Fraser indicated, the goal would be, and as long as the vendor that we've contracted with seems like this is still doable, to have the survey results and a final report produced and in our hands by mid-December, December 13th, which puts us on a good timeline to make sure that we have the opportunity to review that information, do something in January after we get back from the new year. So that's on the survey piece. Questions on that?
So that would mean they would have about 2 to 3 weeks to actually do the survey.
Yes. So in the MOU that we set out, it had this timeline in it, and so the vendors who bid were aware of this timeline. Obviously, things take time, and so we'll have to reassess once the vendor is fully in place. But the goal would be to have something
about, so you don't have to name specific partners, but in terms of access to teachers, where do we stand with that result?
Yeah, so we have,
we're getting a big list of DCPS, and we've got several charters that they've given us. We will submit information. The list will go to the vendor. Right?
yeah, so we are in the process of procuring lists of teachers who recently exited, as Fraser indicated, the last 2 years. And as he stated, that information will be shared directly with the vendor through very strict, MOU agreements to make sure that that information is confidential, that it's not, it will not be shared, with the state board. It's clearly going to be used by the vendor to administer and contact exited teachers.
To clarify, I don't think we're clear totally on that we're getting that list.
Which list?
From this list. So we're still in the process of working.
We're in the process of getting
Lists.
DCPS teachers, PCS teachers. They're in the works. Nothing is in hand until we actually have a vendor that the list can be given to.
Last follow-up question. So therefore, that means that timeline may be adjusted.
It's fluid.
It is fluid, yes, it is. But the individuals that we've been in constant communication with folks, keeping them updated about where we are with the vendor to anticipate things starting soon. And so,
And that's the problem, right? It's the same problem with the it's the information getting wrong. It's like being a dentist for everyone.
I'm not sure of that analogy, but we could check.
I'll explain it to you. Yeah. Extraction.
Got it. Okay, I know got it now.
What was that?
She said pulling teeth. That's how it
he said dentist.
He jazzed it up.
Any other clarifying questions on the survey report?
You guys want to report?
Or do you want me to talk about the research?
Yeah, why don't you go first, because that's the good news.
Well, we are moving forward tentatively with the research. There are still conversations similarly that need to be given the green light, but things seem promising, and we're hoping that we can put out an MOU within the next few weeks, if ideally by next week, and to begin the research by January. And just to recap what we're researching and where we ultimately landed is that we want to investigate ELA second grade. We're hoping to identify a school or maybe perhaps 2 schools per ward, so that there is a small sample across the city where we would look at second grade ELA assignments to measure the extent to which they are aligned to grade level expectations and the work products that come from students from those schools. We want and expect to have cross sampling from DCPS and charters. I think that's about it, with the expectation that a report would be made public by spring, so May, June of 2020.
But we need actually input from the full committee.
Yes.
We'll be talking to you soon about what we're, just more details.
Great reminder. So we'll actually share it with everyone. Today we were making the final tweaks to the
Working report, or the statement of work.
the statement of work, and specifically we need Marcus and Jesse to sign off and just give a green light in writing and email, and then we can move forward.
And we'll get this to actually read the draft before we do that.
Oh yeah, no, I'm gonna send it to you. So just to be clear, the process. So we talked about it. Matt is making some edits. We're merging edits. We're gonna tweak that, then send it to you. So it may come tonight. It may come tomorrow. And then if you respond, then the only other thing we just need the green light from. And if it comes tomorrow, it will be me, not Matt. I'm sure Matt is already in my inbox.
Speaking of green lights from DCPS, It's a good segue. So that's what we're waiting for, pretty much, I would say, with the other pieces of this well-rounded education research. So, in other words, things haven't changed that much since we last spoke, I guess. You have seen the camera roof on the survey piece, and then the other piece of this is the what do you call it? The master schedules that we've been collecting, and that's still in process. But my thought is that we have enough now that we could actually. What I would like to do is assemble focus groups, charter and DCPS focus groups, and maybe separate. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, with school leaders who have given us their master schedules, so we have something sort of to look at together. But we're still kind of waiting for the okay from DCPS. In the meantime, I have been reaching out just informally a little bit to charter leaders, and they're interested in doing this. And so it's a question of whether we've sort of missed the window of time to go forward with the charters. We could go forward with the charter, so that's what we're going to talk about. You know, if that's something we just need to do it like right now, if we want to have it in January.
And the issue is DCPS may not share the schedules with us.
No, it's not that. It's ideally what we want. In our conversation with Matt, you know, he was saying it would be great if the email came from us, right, to the school leaders that you want to involve. And I agree, that would be great. And so that's kind of what we're waiting for.
Are we having a committee meeting in any point?
Yes, good question. Yes, we are.
Okay.
I think it's been more just a matter
We're
of
all doing that right now.
yeah.
That's kind of what I'm getting.
We just haven't, to answer your question, because I kept thinking, you know, we met with Matt like 3 weeks ago, and I thought that we would have more now to talk about, so it's just felt like it's been on. But I think we should, like, especially if we're going to move forward with these things. So be in touch with you. And that's it. Questions, social studies?
Sure. Okay, so updates. We had a meeting with Aussie, we being Ruth and Matt and I. We met with the superintendent and we talked with her about the work plan that I shared with the Social Studies Committee and shared with the full board, and about the conversations we've had to date with other state boards and other state education agencies. We landed on a place where Aussie is interested. They are willing to move forward with us. They are still thinking internally about how to budget for and build capacity to work on these standards. We talked about the idea of a division of labor between the state board and OSSI, focusing on the state board having the advise and consent role, but deeply enmeshed with and in partnership with OSSI as they began thinking about developing content, finding folks to write the standards, etc. So we have we talked about the next meeting happening in early December to talk specifically around who would comprise an advisory group to be the partnership SBOE from external folks, LEA folks, etc., who would help advise on what is good about the standards currently that we want to keep, what needs to be changed, who would then play a role throughout the process in that advisory capacity, not the writing committee, not the teachers or folks deeply enmeshed in that. So the next meeting in December with OSSI is specifically to talk about what kind of folks would be in this advisory committee, how would we select them, when would we select them, when we get started, because right now we've talked about starting that in early 2020. On Monday, Alex was kind enough to host me for the Student Advisory Committee to talk with students on the Student Advisory Committee about social studies. So I asked 4 questions. I asked them, what did they think about when they thought about social studies? I got a lot of history, politics, boring. And then they opened up a little bit when we talked. Boring was not first. I was super impressed by that. Then all of the students really began to open up more as we talked about what kind of things they experienced in middle school, elementary and middle school. As part of their social studies, they talked a lot about basic geography, civil rights, the Tea Party, meaning the Boston Tea Party, not the political party. The War of 1812, activists, a trip to Gettysburg. So they talked a lot about that in elementary school. Then they talked about discussion of causes and effects really being something that came on when they were in middle school, as well as research and group projects. And we talked about what they would change, what they liked about social studies in their instruction, what they would want to see different. We had a really interesting conversation on AP. And when AP was done well, it really seemed to resonate for students. When AP was done more as a, here's a list of 1,000 things you gotta memorize and let's get through it, less exciting, less helpful. They talked a lot about projects. They talked about the big history project, National History Day. They talked about things beyond a textbook. And really, for them, the thing that resonated that they liked the most was understanding how things happened in context, being able to connect things over time. And then we talked about what was missing. And one of the things that was really fascinating was some of the students really felt like multiple points of view were missing from history. We only know history from the winners. And who else are we missing in there? Depth versus coverage. How do we really make sense of history and talk about objectivity versus subjectivity and how it's being presented to us? I was, by the way, super impressed. If you have the chance to go and be part of this student advisory group ever, they're fantastic. I stuck around for the conversation that Alex and another student led, where they did sort of a Four Corners activity about some of their subcommittees. And I left there super energized. My grad school class that night was way better because I started out with a discussion of the wonderful conversation I had with our high schoolers. So I really can't say enough wonderful things about the group. The last thing I asked was how they like to be involved in the standards process. They talked about, my favorite comment came from a young man at DCI who said, you know those Google Form surveys? Don't do those. Yeah, he was quite clear on that. And instead suggested that we think about focus groups or opportunities to have students part of a task force, and or going in to make sure the students are educated on the standards, that they even know what we're asking about, and that they have a chance to really be part of it. So, I could rave about them forever, but that was really great on Monday. We have Social Studies Committee meeting coming up on the 13th at 9 a.m. and again on December 6th. What I hope we can talk about on the 13th specifically is how to organize the panel. We're going to talk briefly tonight about your recommendations for panelists. And then I'm going to give people a homework assignment. I'm going to give everybody a printed copy of the standards. Because when we meet in December, one of the things I want to make sure we do as a committee is talk about what we heard from the speakers at the November public meeting, the panel on social studies, in the context of what the standards actually say, and then we actually start diving in on what we think about the standards so that we are informed and have that mindset. So, panelists for November the 20th. I've already recruited a few just to have in my back pocket in case you all didn't have good suggestions. I know you have wonderful suggestions though. So, we are looking for teachers or LEA-based folks who can talk knowledgeably about their experience with the social studies standards. So this could be an instructional coach or a social studies supervisor. It could be a grade department chair for the social studies. Scott Abbott is going to be at the National Council for the Social Studies, I'm pretty sure, so he will likely not be able to be present. But he and I are in conversations about who else might make sense to have speak with us. But if you've got names for me, please email them to me. You don't need to give them to me right now, but email those names to me. And then if you would like to reach out to them, I've got a draft email that I'll give back to all of you to just pop in all the relevant facts, put your personal touch on it, and send it out. November the 20th, our November public meeting. So like 14 days from now.
Yeah. So question. So I don't have specific names.
Okay.
So I'm not sure where to go with this, but I think it would be great for the people that are coming to have a sense, more from the charters, because like BCPS, I think people have a general sense of what goes on there. With a lot of questions worth asking and answering. But in terms of charters, and we've talked about this, is to what extent do they use the social studies standards? To what extent do they teach it in the early grades? To what extent does their ELA combine it? In other words, there's all sorts of organizational questions about how they approach social studies that I don't think, I certainly have no idea about. And thinking about how to go forward on what the standards should look like, what would make them desirable, would be great to hear. So whether it's other names and other levels, or just those questions for these people.
Yep.
And to make sure that we have some lower grade people.
Absolutely. And you anticipated the next question, which is, please also tell me what questions you'd like me to address in your testimony. Yeah, because again, I've got a couple in my back pocket if you don't come up with good ones. But I think you all, like the questions you just asked about, are they using the DC Social Studies standards? Are they teaching it in the early grades? What materials are they using to teach it? Because the standards still are not curricula, so are they adopting curricula? Are they working with any of the project-based organizations like MICFA or We the People or One World or Live and Learn It or any of those? So I've got a set as well, but if you've got things you'd like to hear them talk about.
Do they work?
Do the standards work?
Yeah.
What would it look like for them to work?
Well, I know that I didn't feel that the English standards were relevant.
So, like, are they relevant to students?
I mean, when you were talking about the student answers, and you're talking about the everything is about the winners. I mean, I can remember my history book when I was a freshman in college. I still have the book. It's got plenty of captions over the pictures. Which is what I did.
Self-created captions.
Yeah, but it was like there were two black people in the whole history of the United States. George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington. I don't know one history book.
Yes,
Since 1962.
that's right. 60. That wasn't his.
But I mean, the work, yeah, but you know,
Yeah.
If we're putting out a new set of standards, there has to be some relevance to it, and just talk about it all this stuff. But there really needs to be, I think there needs to be, I would like to have a new teacher, a new history teacher on the panel, who's, hasn't been teaching for a while.
Got any names for me?
Not at all.
Okay.
I will send some names. I think I introduced you to someone from Bangkok before.
Yes.
I think she would be great.
And I just heard a great Dunbar social studies teacher today speak at the Civics Atlantic Live event. I tweeted at her earlier, so I'm going to find the name. Shalina Warren, Dr. Shalina Warren, who was talking about, she's a history teacher at Dunbar, she directs the Law Academy there, and was talking about how her students made November Dunbar History Month, because it was striking to them how few of the students, but also how few of the faculty knew about the history of Dunbar High School as the first high school for black students in Washington, D.C., and how important that was. And so now it's become this school-wide effort, but really led by students.
And just for as a side note, the principal was Francis L.
So apparently, maybe we all need to be part of a DC High School History Month.
It wasn't Dunbar. It was the Colored High School.
That's right.
And he started the business school as far with the
I was going to say, in terms of topics,
Yes.
maybe in the spirit of DC statehood, I've heard feedback, and it may be worth asking, when DC history is introduced in the content of the standards, in terms of sequence, and what I've gathered from teachers is that they feel it's too late. I'm not sure.
Oh, it comes to.
It comes too late in the sequence.
Comes into
Too late for.
So students are forming their idea of what the world is, and then years later, then find out what their own hometown is about.
Should be throughout. Yeah.
And there is a unit in the elementary school, but to Ruth's point, whether or not all schools are teaching social studies in the elementary grades, or if they're doing social studies content via ELA, that may really
They
be
may have
affected.
to wait till like junior high school or high school to learn about DC if they don't get
No, I
it.
do think it's, I want to say it's third or fourth grade,
Okay.
It's fourth grade.
but many feel as though that's too late, or maybe it should be throughout.
Yeah. I guess, so one thing I was thinking about was my conversation with Reggie, and I was asking him, so Reggie's a social studies teacher at Banneker, and I was asking him if he felt like the standards, if they helped him to first he said yes, and he was explaining what he did. But then as he got further, he's like, well, I guess that's just what I do. I don't think that has to do with the standards. And then he was like, yeah, no.
Yeah.
So I think that's a piece of just, it would be worth exploring. Like, I don't know what that would look like exactly, but he felt like that would actually be interesting. Like, if that was a component of it, you know, and it gave maybe tips, you know, or it was, you know, kind of sidebars that said, you know, if you are working with groups of students who are, you know, whatever.
Yeah, in the standards itself.
Right. So that was one piece, and then I guess I'm always interested in the extent to which standards encourage real-world learning. You know, what we're calling 21st century learning, which is really, you know, in progressive ed has been around for 150 years, which is, you know, how much does it encourage thinking about things in a way that isn't. What did you say?
Boilerplate.
Yeah, well, now I was about to say, you know, it's more about using habits of mind, dispositions of mind, and content, and now I'm realizing the standards aren't really about content as much. So the history, the social studies. It is. So it is, and then it kind of gets at what you were talking about the students bringing out, you know, depth over breadth. So I guess it's, yeah, like, to what extent is it, and does it encourage an active study of something that should be active, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Social studies.
Indeed.
Yes.
Well,
No. Did, sir.
Yeah.
Think about that.
So I'll end on this note. The last update for the committee, thank you for all these questions. You will get an email from me reminding you to send me names and reminding you to add any questions to the list. And then we can go ahead and get these out to the teachers. The last thing that I'll say is that I went to an event this morning that Alex was also at that was about the future of civics at the Atlantic, hosted by the Atlantic Live at the museum. And there were a bunch of interesting panels, but to your point, the last panel of the day was the presidents of Hopkins, Johns Hopkins University, Howard University, and Davidson University. And I really, I'm sorry, Davidson College. My apologies. I really appreciated this quote that the president of Howard gave, and it goes exactly to your point, Dr. O'Leary. The idea that he was asked, he's a medical doctor, he's an oncologist, and he was asked, so should we be doing more science and data as we're trying to get young people prepared to leave university and out in the world, or should we be focusing more on the liberal arts if we want them to really be civically engaged? And he said, human interaction is the most important tool in learning about the human condition. And so for him, even medical doctors really need this human interaction. And to your point about the social studies and this real world learning, like, I think that'll be very interesting for us to consider as we go forward. So, great event. You should watch it. I think they televised it or they like taped it. Really interesting stuff.
Two things. Can I put two things in?
Is it on social studies?
Sort of.
Let me just say, it's on social studies, you can finish, otherwise we have two other agenda items and then new business. So if it's relevant, you're welcome to put it in.
I thought I was going to do it at the end.
Okay. So, all right, I want to just do a quick leadership report. One thing coming out of Jessica's report on social studies is, you know, the idea, I think, is to do another one of these at some point down the road next year, and then eventually and more. So also, we can be thinking about, like, if this is sort of a general panel where we're asking a lot of questions of general people, we can also think about questions that we might put down the line that would be more focused. So it's, everybody here loves the subject, so I'm sure we'll be reviewing. All right, so just I wanted to raise a couple of things. One is for the December meeting. Fraser raised doing something either then or in the future around these homeless students and other issues coming out of those reports, which I like. I also wanted to put on the table the idea of trying to do something around sort of the reading RTI, sort of following up a little bit on what the council did, to sort of flesh out some of the issues that came up with. There's a lot of discussion about the teacher training issue, and I talked to some of the people that were organizing this, and maybe get some of the get people to come talk about what would it take, because one of the issues was regular ed teachers aren't necessarily trained in the things that they need to know to do either the screenings or the interventions for early reading and intervention in RTI, and at the same time, the special ed teachers, where eventually kids get referred, don't know the reading stuff. It sort of falls through the cracks. So one possibility would be to have some people come in to sort of start fleshing that out, which is relevant to a number of things that we're working on and potentially could converge with some of this work that's going on in the council. So I just want to put that out there to see what people thought about that. So. Well, if people have further ideas on it, pro or con, or what it should include, email me. Because we'll start thinking about that December meeting. I want to start raising those here more. It's been sort of a slog to sort of just kind of keep up with stuff and get stuff on the agenda, but I'm going to raise that. The other thing is that following up on a meeting that Marcus and I had with Chairman Mendelson back in the summer, he asked us to come back to talk about some things. So we're going to be going there. And what I have on our list, and I guess he has some things, is to sort of talk about the teacher turnover legislation that we've already sent there. Also to talk specifically about that addendum we put onto it about providing the board with information, access to information, which also raises sort of a series of, sort of gets into the whole governance issue. So we'll try to just sort of raise that, sort of see where that goes. So anyway, so if there's other, and I think one of the things that came out of here, well, maybe no, that was. So if you have other ideas of things you'd like to just get raised and sort of surfaced, and
I have a question actually related to the governance question. Whatever happened to Mary Chase bill, and it isn't ever going to come up again?
she is interested in raising it again. That's about all I can say.
Okay. And there's no role for us in that way.
Well, no, I think if it would get introduced, there could be very much a role for us. And I think the role for, you could send her an email and say it would be a great idea. Actually, I think that would be a great idea. She is interested in it, you know, then now she's doing the Jack Evans piece. So, right, I think, you know, at least before we see the clubhouse.
I was going to suggest adding, I'm not sure the extent to which the chairman is aware of our priorities, but there's social studies, where there's research, and so I think just having another advocate could be helpful, as well as bringing up some of the access issues we have to information. I think if we could get him to be an advocate and pushing or with us, that could be important.
Yeah, and that's a super easy segue, given that the legislation will hopefully give us that access. And I think on a lot of these projects that we talk about, right, access to that information has been the biggest barrier to progress and stuff. I think that's very natural.
Also,
I think the legislation is very specific, right, to teacher data. So whereas
yeah, no, so there's an amendment that would give the state board pretty much the same authority that
requesting.
Right, that we could request information from district government agencies.
I guess my point is it's less about the information and it's more so participation or access. So like several of our, I guess some of it is information, but it's also like we need them to lean in with us. And I just think if he's aware of that, not that he can make them do it, but.
I mean, I hear you saying both lean in on these specific things, but also raise, you know, what do you think? Shouldn't we be doing some more? What more could that be, and how might we move forward?
But no, I agree.
Yeah. But on the information issue, I mean, the issue was raised, it's like we just don't have, right, the authority to really move as quickly as we need on a lot of these issues. And I think it was mentioned in the meeting. It's like, oh, you guys did great work on teacher turnover. And I'm like, well, just getting to where we are now took over 2 years, right? But if we had that information, that authority, we could move a lot faster.
and
quintessential example, frankly, that was today's hearing on financial literacy, where members of the council asked why the state board wasn't working on financial literacy standards. And
Asking me.
Pete Frazier, state board has looked at financial literacy standards a number of times through the high school graduation task force, and then 2 years before that, pretty much every time we look at that, and there are specific reasons why we haven't moved forward with them in the past. So, all of that information is public in there. So, if we had additional ability to find information on what is being done in schools or around, so that we could actually frame the conversation more holistically, it would be really interesting.
I think another conversation for another day, and our agenda is already set, but I think this also, for me, begs the question about authority from the state board, and I don't know where that comes up with conversations, and again, I
think that's what they were talking about, the very chain bill, just a minute ago.
Oh,
That's what.
oh, that is what you.
That's the bill.
I thought for some reason you were talking about the research bill, but I guess that was already brought up. But to be clear, Mary Chase bill is about like a governing school board, right?
No, it's
very specific. I mean, that, yeah.
If I remember correctly, the Che bill is the one that would provide that we would appoint the state superintendent.
It
gives us
it'd be more like a regular state board, that the state agency wouldn't be under the mayor.
Can you send that to us?
Sure, I could find the old copy.
Okay.
I think it's a conversation worth having, whether it's the specifics laid out in that bill, and there's a lot of room that we're talking about. And I think as much as you all can float those ideas.
I mean, do you think we should do it at a general meeting?
I do. I was going back to the Mendelsohn meeting.
Yeah. No, I hear you. That's.
Yes, but I do think personally, and again, I know people have reservations about going back to a governing board, and my response would be there's a wide distance between where we're at and that, and I think we can have more authority while still keeping the. Yeah, I'm not suggesting that, but I do think having conversations about it, floating, having greater authority, for instance, and we're doing it in piecemeal fashions, whether it's like sliding it in this bill, but I think it's a conversation worth having.
Okay, and executive director. Okay. All right, new business, Frazier.
Oh no, I was just going to mention that I testified about the financial literacy this morning, and we did get it. Mendelsohn kept saying he wasn't pushing back, but he was pushing back about it. I didn't quite understand the concept of it, but it was an interesting conversation. When Robert White came, he was a little bit late. When he came, he explained the fact that there was a bill that had already been approved 2008, I believe, but nothing's been done about it. So that was this morning. I guess this is new business. So this is the last new business. You were talking about DC statehood and DC history and stuff like that. I went to the memorial service for Mark Plotkin today, a friend of mine, and it was fabulous. It was really nice. And Mark was like the advocate for DC statehood in the history of the district. And there were really good speeches. Sharon Pratt gave the best speech I've ever seen in the history of speeches. Vincent spoke, a lot of people spoke. It was a really nice place. Was back, and Mark was someone who would agitate everybody. So it was really funny because the whole auditorium was full. That was it.
I got two things. So I sent it to Serena. I'll share it with the board after this. But on the topic of special education, because there was so much in both reports about special education, there's a recent report out from the Center for Reinventing Public Education on special education in charter schools. They did qualitative case studies of charter schools where special ed seems to be going well. And Capital City in Ward 4 is one of the ones that is highlighted in the report. it's really interesting in the way it talks about special education. That special education basically is a way of educating students, not a place or a set of compliance regulations. So I would encourage folks to read it and then share feedback on what you think about it, because I think it was pretty interesting and relevant. I'll send you the link. The last thing is the Association for Education, Finance, and Policy Conference has opportunities for people to propose policy talks that then become policy briefs. And they actually ask that a proposal for a policy talk have policy makers on the panel. And I happen to be looking at their request for proposals. It's due Friday. But one of the topics they are prioritizing is teacher working conditions and teacher shortages. And another one is local research practice partnerships. And another is role of qualitative research in policy and practice. So I've been to this conference. It's really interesting because there are actually like policymakers and then researchers who are aiming to make their work policy applicable. So if anyone is intrigued by the idea of submitting a proposal, they're not long. They're like 250 word abstract kind of things. They're like real short, and then maybe it's 500. But it's like it's pretty short. I was gonna draft something up and contemplate submitting it on. I wouldn't, if I were doing it alone, I would not do it on the teacher working conditions because I'm not on the committee. But I think that would be a really good one if other people want to jump in on it. That we could propose having a couple of state board members be part of the policy proposal. The conference itself is in March, and it's in Fort Worth, Texas. So
What's the name of it?
it's the Association for Education, Finance, and Policy, AEFP. And I'll send that to you. But if anyone's interested, I'm happy to do the heavy lift on the writing.
Oh, so it would be like us going together.
Yeah, it could be like anyone who was interested. If we got the proposals accepted, we could pick like who would go and present, and then anyone else who might want to invite to join us. All right, I'll send it out as an email.
A couple of things. One is last year I got invited to be a part of a national cohort of a group called School Board Partners, which is a national cohort of leaders, Board of Education leaders around the country who are working to improve outcomes and provide high quality schools for all kids. So the current cohort of folks is from 13 cities around the country, representing about 2 million kids, and they're actually looking for applications for their new cohort. The applications actually due November 30th, and I would love to have a colleague join me on some of these. I'm actually going to they have quarterly meetings, so I'm actually going to our next cohort convening next week. But the applications due November 30th, so if anybody's interested, I'll make sure to send you the information. The second thing I will say, and I'm only saying it because I think it has to be mentioned in this meeting, is that I think given the Nats victory, it also might be good to maybe do a ceremony for the Nats Academy this month. It's in Cairnsville, and they do a lot of great work with young people in 7 and 8 across the city, and I think it would just be a fitting connection. Here's the story.
Everybody should be all their minutes.
Yeah.
Some
Gotta
people
wait
didn't,
that. I can put my orange away and put on some red.
some people didn't pick up their towels at the last board meeting.
It was her birthday.
No, okay.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even,
Yeah.
I wouldn't compensate.
All right, people, are we ready to adjourn?
I think we are.
All right, thank you.
I have to add one thing to say. Obviously reached out to me, and because of the, Justin and asked reached out to me about the, what is it? No, about the, that's a task force member that work with the RTI. And the, report card that we got from,
Education Commission of the state.
States Fair, right? So because of our improvement, they wanted to write a letter of thank you for the award that Asa got for doing these things. And then they reached out to me to write the letter, and I did, and I'm glad to
Anything else? 1, 2.
I need to see that.